Look at him. He's about to lose everything. Ha ha.
The courtroom should have been a place of dignity, but that morning it sounded more like a theater of cruelty. Laughter cut through the air as a man stood alone, shoulders squared, while the three people who knew him best mocked him without restraint. His wife smiled as if she had already won. Her mother looked at him with open disgust. Her lover didn't even bother to hide his arrogance. Everyone believed the outcome was decided. Everyone believed this man had nothing left. Yet no one noticed his hands were steady. No one wondered why he never once begged, argued, or defended himself. Because beneath the humiliation, beneath the public shame, something dangerous was unfolding. A truth so carefully hidden that when it finally surfaced, it would shatter every lie spoken in that room. And it would all begin when the judge chose to speak. Before we dive into this story, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now. And if you're drawn to powerful stories of betrayal, justice, and redemption, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because this is only the beginning. William Smith stood near the back of the courtroom, not because anyone had told him to, but because years of quiet endurance had trained his body to choose the least visible space. The polished wooden benches gleamed under fluorescent lights, the American flag hung motionless behind the judge's seat, and yet the room felt hostile, as if the air itself had already passed judgment on him. He wore a simple gray suit. Not cheap, but not impressive either. The kind of suit that disappeared in a room filled with sharp tailoring and confident postures. Around him, whispers traveled freely. Some came from strangers, journalists, curious onlookers, people who only knew him as a headline. Others came from those who knew his name well enough to twist it into something smaller. "That's him," someone murmured. "The husband," another voice replied, almost amused. "The one about to lose everything." William heard them all. He always did. But he had learned long ago that reacting only gave people permission to dig deeper. So he kept his gaze forward, and eyes resting on a spot just above the judge's bench, breathing slow and even. From the outside, William Smith looked like exactly what they believed him to be, a man who had fallen behind in life. Mid-30s, no visible wealth, no entourage, no confidence that demanded attention. He didn't fidget, didn't pace, didn't plead with his attorney like so many others waiting for their case to be called. He simply stood there, hands loosely folded, as if he were waiting for a train rather than the most humiliating trial of his life. What no one in that room understood was that William had already lived through worse. Years earlier, long before courtrooms and affidavits, William had been the kind of man people relied on without ever thanking. He was methodical, disciplined, and painfully patient. The kind of person who believed that doing the right thing would eventually be enough. Raised in a working-class neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, he learned early that dignity wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was showing up when no one was watching. It was keeping promises, even when they cost you. He had worked his way through college with scholarships and night shifts, earning a degree in information systems. He was good, exceptionally good. Professors noticed, recruiters called, opportunities opened. And then one night, he met Rebecca. She had been magnetic, sharp smile, sharp mind. Big dreams she spoke about as if they were already hers. She saw something in William that others overlooked, not his silence, but his stability. At least that's what he believed at the time. When they married, William didn't hesitate to step back, so Rebecca could step forward. When her career began to accelerate, he adjusted his hours. When she needed emotional support, he became invisible. When sacrifices were required, he made them quietly, convincing himself that partnership meant imbalance sometimes. That love meant patience. But patience, when abused, turns into erasure. By the time Rebecca's world expanded into private dinners, elite circles, and people who spoke in numbers instead of values, William had already begun to disappear from her narrative. He became an inconvenient, a reminder of a past she wanted to outgrow, and eventually something worse, a liability. The courtroom doors opened, snapping William back into the present. Rebecca entered first. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her presence alone commanded attention. Dressed in a tailored navy dress, hair, flawless posture, confident, she moved as if a room belonged to her. At her side walked Dorothy Miller, her mother lips pressed thin with judgment, sharpened by years of entitlement. Behind them, a step slower, but visibly pleased with himself, came Nathan Cole. William felt the shift instantly. The whispers grew louder. Cameras adjusted. A quiet electricity filled the room. Rebecca finally glanced in William's direction, not with anger, not with regret, but with the detached satisfaction of someone who believed the ending was already written. William didn't look away. That surprised her, just for a second. Dorothy noticed too. Her eyes narrowed as if offended by his refusal to shrink further. To her, William had always been a mistake her daughter should have corrected sooner. A man who knew his place and still dared to exist outside it. Nathan, on the other hand, smiled openly. He gave William a nod that wasn't greeting, but confirmation. Confirmation that he believed he had won. That whatever Rebecca had once been to William now belonged fully and legally to him. William felt something stir in his chest then. Not anger, not fear. Something colder, more controlled. A memory of nights spent alone, gathering pieces of information that didn't quite fit. Of documents reviewed quietly. Of patterns observed patiently. Of truths filed away, waiting. He had learned something crucial during the months leading up to this trial. People who mock you in public rarely imagine you're capable of planning in private. The bailiff called for order. Everyone took their seats. William finally sat beside his attorney, a composed woman named Elaine Parker, who gave him a brief glance. Not reassurance, not concern, just acknowledgement. She knew what he had given her. She knew what was coming. Across the aisle, Rebecca laughed softly at something Nathan whispered. Dorothy leaned in, her expression now smug, already rehearsing the satisfaction of watching William be dismantled piece by piece. They all believed the same thing. That William Smith was weak. That silence meant surrender. That dignity was the same as defeat. William rested his hands on the table and exhaled slowly. Let them believe it. Because by the time this courtroom was done with him, the story they had written in their heads would collapse under the weight of the truth they never bothered to look for. And when it did, there would be no laughter left to hide behind. Rebecca Smith sat with her back perfectly straight, legs crossed with deliberate elegance, as if the courtroom were merely another boardroom where she had come to collect what she was owed. From the outside, she looked composed, unbothered, even amused. But beneath the polished surface, there was something sharper at work. A certainty born not of truth, but of entitlement. She had learned to despise William slowly, not all at once, not in a single moment of betrayal or rage. It happened in increments, small, almost invisible fractures that spread over time. At first, it was impatience, then embarrassment, and eventually contempt. Rebecca remembered the early years clearly, though she would never admit it out loud. She remembered how William used to listen when she spoke, how he never interrupted, how he remembered details that even she forgot she had shared. He was steady when her world was chaotic, present when her confidence wavered. In those days, she had called him her anchor, but anchors, she later decided, were meant to be cut. As her career advanced, Rebecca began to live in rooms where ambition was currency and appearances were power. People spoke differently there. They asked questions that made William uncomfortable about investments, influence, connections. Questions he answered honestly without exaggeration or performance. And honesty, she learned, was deeply unimpressive to the wrong audience. At first, she defended him. Briefly, half-heartedly. He's private, she would say. He prefers to stay out of the spotlight. But soon, even those words felt like excuses. And excuses felt like weakness. Rebecca started noticing the way others looked at William. The polite nods, the faint smiles, the subtle dismissals. She noticed how easily Nathan Cole commanded attention with his stories, his confidence, his money. She noticed how Dorothy leaned closer when Nathan spoke, how her mother's approval shifted without apology. And somewhere in that observation, Rebecca made a decision she never consciously acknowledged. She chose admiration over loyalty. By the time she stopped coming home on time, William already knew something had changed. He felt it in the silence between them, in the way Rebecca stopped asking questions about his day, in how she flinched not physically but emotionally when he tried to reach for her. What he didn't know then was how deeply she'd rewritten their story. In her version, William wasn't patient. He was passive. He wasn't supportive. He was dependent. He wasn't quiet. He was irrelevant. So when the affair began, Rebecca justified it with remarkable ease. Nathan represented everything she believed she deserved, now status, speed, visibility. He challenged her in ways William never tried to, or so she told herself. The truth was simpler and far uglier. Nathan made her feel important without asking her to be better. And when it became clear that the marriage could no longer be hidden behind polite lies, Rebecca didn't feel guilt. She felt relief. Relief that she could finally say what she had been thinking for years. The courtroom gave her permission. As the proceedings began, Rebecca leaned slightly toward Nathan, whispering something that made him smile. Dorothy watched William from across the aisle, eyes sharp, lips pressed thin. Rebecca followed her mother's gaze, and for the first time that morning truly looked at the man she was about to dismantle. William hadn't changed. That annoyed her. He didn't look desperate. He didn't look broken. He didn't look like someone clinging to a failing marriage. He looked contained. And containment to Rebecca felt like resistance. When her attorney stood to speak, Rebecca's expression hardened into something rehearsed. She had practiced this moment in her head, how she would sit, how she would react, how she would let the story be told without appearing cruel. But cruelty, she believed, was simply honesty delivered without apology. The attorney began outlining the narrative: an unhappy marriage, emotional neglect, irreconcilable differences. Rebecca nodded at the right moments. She sighed softly when appropriate. She allowed her eyes to glisten, not enough to cry, just enough to appear wounded. Then came the opportunity she had been waiting for. When asked to address the court, Rebecca stood smoothly, heels clicking against the floor. She turned slightly, not toward the judge at first, but toward William. "I supported this marriage for years," she said, voice calm but edged with accusation. "I waited. I tried. But you can't build a future with someone who refuses to grow." A ripple of murmurs moved through the room. Rebecca felt it, the attention, the validation. She continued, "I was mocked for staying, questioned for sacrificing my own potential. And eventually I realized that staying loyal to someone who won't stand up for himself is a form of self-betrayal." Her eyes flicked to William again, daring him to react. He didn't. That silence unsettled her more than any argument could have. Dorothy took that as her cue. With a scoff barely concealed, she leaned forward and muttered loudly enough for several rows, to hear some men are content being shadows. Others are meant to lead. A few quiet chuckles followed. Rebecca felt satisfaction bloom in her chest. This was it. This was the public reckoning. The final confirmation that she had outgrown him, that leaving wasn't cruelty, it was evolution. Nathan leaned back, arms crossed, wearing the relaxed confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. William felt the words land one after another. He absorbed them the way he always had, not by denying them, but by placing them carefully in context. Rebecca didn't hate him because he was weak. She hated him because he had never needed to perform. And in a world obsessed with image that made him dangerous. He thought briefly of the nights he had spent reviewing records, the emails he had never responded to, the accounts he had quietly traced. He thought of how easy it would have been to expose. That was everything earlier, and why he hadn't. Because timing mattered. Because truth, when revealed too soon, was dismissed as bitterness. So he let Rebecca speak. He let her rewrite their history. He let her mock the version of him she had invented to feel justified. Because when the time came, when the full picture emerged, it wouldn't just contradict her words. It would dismantle the very foundation she had built her new life on. Rebecca sat down, chin-lifted expression victorious. She believed she had delivered the final blow. She had no idea she had only made the fall steeper. Dorothy Miller had always believed that respect was something you demanded, not earned. It was a philosophy she had carried with her for decades, reinforced by a life spent climbing social ladders with ruthless efficiency. Sitting in the courtroom now, she surveyed the space. Like a monarch forced to tolerate a lower court, chin-raised lips, tight eyes sharp with judgment. She had never liked William Smith. From the moment Rebecca brought him home years ago, Dorothy had sensed what she called a misalignment. He was polite without being impressive, intelligent without being assertive, courteous without being useful. He listened more than he spoke, and to Dorothy, that was the clearest sign of inadequacy. Men in her world were meant to dominate rooms, to announce their worth before anyone questioned it. William did none of that. She remembered that first dinner vividly. William had arrived on time, dressed neatly, carrying a modest bottle of wine. He had shaken her hand firmly, but without aggression, looked her in the eye, and thanked her for having him. The gesture had irritated her instantly. Politeness, she decided then, was a mask for weakness. As the years passed and Rebecca's ambitions sharpened, Dorothy became more vocal. She criticized William openly, his job, his pace, his unwillingness to push harder. At first, Rebecca had defended him. Then she began to fall silent. And silence, Dorothy knew, was consent. By the time Nathan Cole entered the picture, Dorothy had already chosen sides. Nathan understood her language. He spoke confidently about assets and influence. He laughed loudly, dominated conversations, made promises about futures that sounded expensive. Dorothy watched him the way investors watched markets, with interest, calculation, and expectation. William, in comparison, became a ghost at family gatherings. He would pour wine-clear plates, listen attentively and retreat when the conversation turned sharp. Dorothy took his retreat as confirmation. So when the marriage began to fracture publicly, Dorothy felt no shame in accelerating the collapse. And now, seated in the courtroom, she saw an opportunity she had waited years for. Public humiliation. As Rebecca finished her statement and sat down, Dorothy leaned forward slightly, her movement subtle but intentional. When the judge's attention shifted momentarily to the attorneys, Dorothy spoke just loudly enough. "This is what happens when you marry beneath your potential." A few heads turned. A ripple of restrained laughter followed. Dorothy did not apologize. She never did. She turned her gaze fully on William, then eyes cold assessing. To her irritation, he still hadn't broken. He hadn't lowered his head. He hadn't reacted. He sat with his hands folded, posture straight, as if her words hadn't even reached him. That defiance, quiet, unspoken, made her blood simmer. Dorothy decided she would not be ignored. When given the chance to address the court as a character witness, she rose slowly, deliberately drawing attention with practiced ease. She adjusted her jacket, cleared her throat, and faced the judge with an expression of weary patience, as if she were the one enduring an inconvenience. "I've known William Smith for many years," she began, voice smooth, measured, "and I say this with no pleasure. But my daughter suffered in that marriage." Rebecca lowered her eyes, playing the role perfectly. Dorothy continued, "William is not a bad man, but he lacks ambition. He lacks initiative. And in today's world, that's not just unfortunate, it's damaging." She paused, letting the words settle. "A marriage requires two people moving forward together. My daughter was running. He was standing still." Dorothy turned just slightly enough to make William the silent focal point of her criticism. I watched her shrink herself for him. I watched her opportunities pass because she felt obligated to protect his ego. And eventually, she had to choose herself. The implication was clear. William wasn't just inadequate, he was a burden. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Dorothy felt the familiar rush of control. This was her element: narrative, perception, power. She sat down with a satisfied nod, convinced she had delivered the final verdict before the judge ever could. William exhaled slowly. Dorothy's words hadn't surprised him. If anything, they confirmed what he'd always known. Dorothy didn't hate him because he failed Rebecca. She hated him because he never needed her approval. As the proceedings continued, William's mind drifted not to anger, but to memory. He recalled the countless moments Dorothy had dismissed him with a glance, the backhanded compliments, the public jabs disguised as concern. He remembered how often Rebecca had remained silent beside her mother, neither defending nor denying. Silence, he had learned, could wound more deeply than words. Yet what Dorothy never understood was that William's restraint was not submission. It was observation. He had watched Dorothy maneuver people for years, leveraging guilt and status like weapons. He had watched her influence Rebecca's decisions subtly at first, then aggressively. And when the financial irregularities began, small discrepancies in shared accounts, documents that didn't align, William had paid attention. Dorothy believed herself untouchable because she believed herself invisible. That was her mistake. Across the aisle, Nathan leaned toward Rebecca, whispering something that made her smile again. Dorothy noticed and approved. This was how it should have been all along. Strength aligned with strength. Winners choosing winners. The judge called for a short recess. As people stood and conversations erupted, Dorothy glanced once more at William. For the first time, she noticed something that unsettled her. He was calm, not resigned, not numb. Calm like someone who knew exactly where the ground beneath him stood and exactly how fragile the ground beneath others was. Dorothy frowned, dismissing the thought. Men like William didn't surprise people. They faded quietly and left messes behind. She had no idea how wrong she was. As the court reconvened and everyone returned to their seats, Dorothy crossed her arms, confident the worst was already behind her. In her mind, the story was complete. The weak husband exposed, the ambitious daughter liberated, the future secured. But stories, William knew, had a way of changing when the wrong assumptions were made. And Dorothy Miller had built her certainty on the most dangerous assumption of all: that she was the smartest person in the room. Nathan Cole had never doubted how this would end. From the moment he walked into the courthouse that morning, tailored suit, crisp watch gleaming under the lights, he carried himself like a man attending a celebration rather than a trial. To him, this wasn't a legal proceeding. It was a formality, a final stamp on a reality he already owned. He had won Rebecca. He had outgrown William. And soon the law would confirm it. Nathan sat with one ankle resting casually on his knee, fingers drumming lightly against his thigh. He smiled often, but not warmly. His smiles were meant to be seen, meant to signal confidence to anyone watching. He knew people were watching. He thrived on it. Unlike William, Nathan had learned early that perception mattered more than truth. He had grown up surrounded by men who spoke loudly and moved fast, who understood that dominance wasn't about substance. It was about timing and intimidation. By the time he built his first successful venture, Nathan already knew how to read a room, how to take credit without earning it, how to surround himself with people who mistook arrogance for authority. Rebecca had been easy to read. She wanted more recognition, more admiration, more distance from the life she felt embarrassed by. Nathan had given her all of that not through patience or sacrifice, but through certainty. He told her what she wanted to hear, and more importantly, he said it loudly enough that others noticed. William, by contrast, barely registered in Nathan's mental landscape. At first, when Rebecca spoke of her husband, Nathan had assumed he was harmless, a background figure, someone who would quietly sign papers and disappear. That assumption had pleased him. It made everything simpler. But as the trial approached, Nathan began to notice small inconsistencies, subtle things, delays that didn't make sense, requests from Rebecca's legal team that seemed overly cautious, financial questions that surfaced unexpectedly. He dismissed them. Men like William didn't plan. They reacted. Too late. So when Rebecca mocked her husband openly, when Dorothy sharpened the knife with practiced cruelty, Nathan allowed himself to enjoy the spectacle. He leaned forward at one point just enough for William to see him, and whispered loudly enough to be overheard. He should have stepped aside sooner. A few people nearby chuckled. Nathan waited for William to flinch, to glare, to finally show anger. William didn't even look at him. That annoyed Nathan more than he cared to admit. During a brief pause in proceedings, Nathan's phone vibrated. A message from his assistant flashed across the screen, something about a delayed transfer confirmation. Nathan frowned slightly, thumb hovering, then locked the screen. It could wait. Nothing important ever went wrong on days like this. When the court resumed, Nathan leaned back again, confidence restored. The next phase of testimony focused on finances, shared assets, disputed accounts, allegations of mismanagement. Nathan listened with only half an ear. He already knew how this would be framed: William as the stagnant partner, Rebecca as the primary contributor, Nathan as the future. Then William's attorney stood. Elaine Parker didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She simply asked for permission to clarify a few points before moving forward. Nathan smirked. Clarification was a language of desperation. Elaine began by presenting a timeline: dates, transfers, ownership records. At first, nothing sounded alarming. Standard procedure. Nathan's confidence remained intact. Then she paused. And for the court's clarity, Elaine said calmly, "We'd like to confirm the relationship between Mr. Nathan Cole and the following financial entities." Nathan straightened slightly. Elaine listed 3 company names. The first Nathan recognized immediately. The second made his jaw tighten. The third he wasn't expecting. Rebecca turned toward him, confusion flickering across her face. Elaine continued. These entities appear to share overlapping accounts, unusual transaction patterns, and in several cases, authorization signatures that do not match the registered signatories. The courtroom stirred. Nathan forced a chuckle under his breath. This is ridiculous, he muttered loud enough for Rebecca to hear. But she didn't laugh with him. For the first time, Nathan felt something unfamiliar creep into his chest. Uncertainty. Elaine wasn't finished. She displayed a document on the screen, a contract bearing Nathan's name, but with discrepancies highlighted in yellow. Dates that overlapped with other commitments. Funds routed through intermediaries. Signatures that appeared off. Nathan leaned forward, now elbows on his knees. This document, Elaine said, was executed during a period when Mr. Smith was still legally married to Mrs. Smith. It involves assets jointly acquired during that marriage. Rebecca's breath caught. Nathan's smile faded. Elaine turned slightly, addressing the judge directly. We are not suggesting conclusions at this stage, only presenting facts that raise questions. Nathan shifted in his seat, pulse quickening. He glanced toward Dorothy, who looked displeased, but not alarmed. Toward Rebecca, whose expression had changed entirely. She wasn't smiling anymore. The judge nodded slowly, eyes narrowing with interest. Nathan cleared his throat. With all due respect, he said, standing abruptly, this feels like an attempt to distract from the real issue here. Elaine met his gaze calmly. The real issue, Mr. Cole, is transparency. The word landed heavier than expected. Nathan sat back down, jaw clenched. His phone vibrated again. This time, he checked it. We need to talk. Something's not lining up. Nathan's fingers tightened around the device. Across the room, William Smith remained still. He had watched Nathan's posture change. Had noticed the subtle tightening of the shoulders, the forced composure beginning to crack. William didn't feel satisfaction. He felt confirmation. Nathan Cole wasn't untouchable. He was just unchallenged. The judge called for a short recess to review the submitted materials. As people stood and conversations erupted, Nathan leaned toward Rebecca. This is nothing, he whispered a little too quickly. Just procedural noise. Rebecca didn't respond. She was staring across the room at William. For the first time since the trial began, Nathan followed her gaze. William met his eyes then. Not with anger, not with triumph. With something far worse. Understanding. Nathan felt a chill crawl up his spine, because in that moment he realized something he had never considered before. William Smith hadn't been silent because he was weak. He had been silent because he was waiting, and whatever Elaine Parker had just placed on the record was only the beginning. Nathan leaned back in his chair, the confidence he'd worn like armor now, feeling thin, almost fragile. He swallowed hard. For the first time since he entered that courtroom, Nathan Cole wondered not if he would win, but how much he stood to lose. If the courtroom had felt hostile, before it now felt suspended, caught between two realities that could no longer coexist. On one side sat Rebecca Dorothy and Nathan, their earlier confidence, fractured but not yet broken. On the other sat William Smith, unchanged in posture, unchanged in expression, as if the subtle shift in momentum had been expected all along. The murmurs that once mocked him had softened into uncertainty. Journalists leaned forward. Observers stopped whispering and started listening. This was the stage where most men would crumble. The case against William, at least on the surface, still looked overwhelming. The legal filings painted him as the underperforming spouse, the one who contributed less financially, the one who benefited from Rebecca's rising success without matching it. Charts had been prepared. Numbers arranged neatly to tell a very specific story. A hopeless story. Rebecca's attorney resumed confidently, stepping forward, as if nothing significant had occurred moments earlier. His voice was polished, practiced, carrying the weight of preparation and expectation. The facts remain clear, he said. Mr. Smith failed to contribute equitably to the marriage. Mrs. Smith carried the financial and professional burden. The dissolution of this marriage reflects an imbalance that can no longer be ignored. Rebecca nodded, grateful for the familiar rhythm of accusation. Dorothy folded her arms again, reassured by the return to narrative. Nathan exhaled slowly, convincing himself that the earlier discomfort was nothing more than a temporary distraction. The attorney continued presenting figures that compared Rebecca's reported income to William's modest salary. He emphasized the disparity repeatedly, as if saying it often enough would make it absolute truth. William listened without interruption. He had expected this. In fact, he had counted on it. Elaine Parker rose only when the attorney finished, not to object, but to ask a single measured question. "May we clarify what is meant by contribution, Your Honor?" The judge nodded. Elaine turned back to the courtroom. "Because contribution can be measured in more ways than income alone." She began calmly, almost gently, walking the court through a timeline that reframed the data. Not disputing the numbers, but contextualizing them. She explained how William had reduced his hours when Rebecca requested flexibility during a critical phase of her career. How he had taken on domestic responsibilities so she could travel freely. How he had declined offers that required relocation because Rebecca wanted stability. Each of these decisions, Elaine said, was mutual, documented, and supported by correspondence. Emails appeared on the screen. Messages written by Rebecca herself, thanking William for his support, acknowledging his sacrifices, promising they were temporary. Rebecca stiffened. Nathan shifted uncomfortably. Elaine continued to portray these choices now as failures is not just misleading, it is inaccurate. Rebecca's attorney attempted to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand. Let her finish. Elaine nodded and moved on. Furthermore, she said the claim that Mr. Smith benefited from Mrs. Smith's success overlooks a crucial detail. She paused. Several assets attributed solely to Mrs. Smith were acquired during the marriage and funded at least in part through accounts established and managed by Mr. Smith. A ripple moved through the courtroom. William felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not anxiety, but anticipation. This was the line they hadn't expected him to cross. Rebecca turned sharply toward her attorney, whispering urgently. Dorothy leaned forward, eyes narrowed. Nathan stared at the screen, scanning documents faster than he would process them. Elaine didn't rush. She allowed the confusion to breathe. Mr. Smith's professional background, she continued, is in information systems and financial analytics. He managed long-term planning, optimization, and oversight. Much of this work was conducted quietly behind the scenes. Quietly. The word echoed. William remembered the nights spent reviewing budgets while Rebecca slept. The weekends spent restructuring accounts to accommodate her growing income. The countless conversations where she said, "You handle it, you're better with details." He had handled it. And now the very systems he had built were being used to discredit him. Or so they thought. Rebecca's attorney stood again, voice tight. "Even if that were true, it does not change the reality that Mrs. Smith out-earned income is not ownership," Elaine replied calmly. "Nor is visibility equivalent to control." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Miss Parker," he said, "are you suggesting misrepresentation?" "I am suggesting," Elaine answered carefully, "that the financial portrait presented to this court is incomplete." That was enough. The judge ordered a brief adjournment to review the newly introduced materials. As the courtroom broke into hushed movement, Rebecca stood abruptly, her composure cracking. "This isn't what we discussed," she hissed at her attorney. Dorothy shot William a venomous look, as if daring him to claim credit for anything. Nathan stepped away, pulling out his phone again, fingers moving faster now, urgency replacing arrogance. William remained seated. He didn't need to look at them. He could feel the shift. The case that once seemed hopeless was no longer one-sided. The narrative they had relied on, the story of a weak man carried by a powerful woman, was unraveling under scrutiny. And still, William hadn't said a word. That unsettled them more than any argument ever could, because deep down, Rebecca began to realize something terrifying. William hadn't defended himself because he didn't need to. He had let them speak, let them mock, let them build a case on assumptions and appearances. And now, with every document Elaine presented, those assumptions were being quietly dismantled. The judge returned expression unreadable. "Proceed," he said. William felt the weight of the moment settle not as pressure, but as release. The worst part was over. From here on, the truth would do the work for him. And the people who once laughed would soon understand the cost of underestimating a man who never needed to announce his strength. The courtroom lights seemed harsher now. No longer flattering, no longer theatrical. They exposed details people would rather keep hidden. Tightened jaws, restless hands' eyes that refused to meet one another. The story that had once felt simple was beginning to feel dangerous. As the proceedings continued, William Smith found himself drifting not away from the moment, but deeper into it. Because this was never just about numbers or documents. It was about the marriage they were now dissecting, like a corpse, each side claiming to know when it truly died. In truth, the marriage had been built on compromises that only one of them remembered making. Years earlier, when Rebecca first told William about the opportunity that would change everything, a position that required constant travel, unpredictable hours, and complete commitment, he had listened without interruption. She spoke with urgency, fear, excitement. She spoke about what it meant, what it could become. When she finished, she waited. William had nodded. "We'll make it work," he had said. That was always his answer. He adjusted his schedule, declined promotions that required relocation, shifted his priorities without complaint. When friends asked why he wasn't pushing harder, he smiled and said timing mattered. When family asked why he always seemed tired, he brushed it off. What he never did was keep score. Rebecca noticed, and at first she appreciated it. But appreciation faded quickly in the face of ambition. As her world expanded, William's role quietly shrank. Conversations became transactional. Affection became conditional. Silence filled the spaces where partnership once lived. Then came the signs William couldn't ignore. Emails left open too long, calls taken in other rooms. A sudden obsession with privacy that felt rehearsed. When he asked gentle questions, Rebecca responded with irritation. When he withdrew, she accused him of disengagement. It was a cycle designed to exhaust him. And it almost worked. The night William discovered the first concrete proof of betrayal, he didn't confront her. He sat alone in their home office staring at a ledger that didn't align. An account he didn't recognize. A transaction routed through an unfamiliar entity. He felt the cold clarity settle in. This wasn't carelessness. It was deliberate. From that moment on, William stopped reacting and started observing. He traced patterns, followed timelines, compared documents. He noticed how Rebecca's financial footprint overlapped with Nathan's. How certain decisions coincided too neatly with personal changes. How assets quietly shifted hands under the cover of marital trust. Still, he said nothing. Because accusation without evidence was surrender. In court now, as Elaine Parker methodically continued dismantling the narrative, William felt those long nights resurface not with bitterness, but with purpose. Elaine called attention to shared property records. to emails acknowledging joint planning, to agreements Rebecca had signed without reading, carefully trusting William to manage the details, as she always had. Rebecca's expression shifted from annoyance to unease. She had believed that love once withdrawn erased obligation. She had been wrong. Elaine's voice remained steady. Mr. Smith did not disappear from this marriage. He was gradually pushed out of visibility. Rebecca's attorney objected. Speculation, he snapped. Documented behavior, Elaine corrected, producing message threads that contradicted Rebecca's earlier statements. The judge allowed it. Rebecca's breath quickened. Across the aisle, Nathan leaned forward, his earlier swagger now replaced by calculation. He was beginning to understand the shape of the trap forming around him, not yet fully, but enough to feel the walls closing. Elaine paused, then said something that shifted the energy in the room. There is a misconception that Mr. Smith was unaware of his wife's actions. She looked directly at the judge. He was aware. He simply chose not to respond impulsively. Rebecca's head snapped up. William felt her eyes on him, then, searching, panicked. For the first time, she saw him not as a passive figure in her story, but as an active one in his own. The judge leaned back slightly, studying William with renewed interest. "Mr. Smith," he said, "you've remained silent throughout much of this process." William stood. The room went still. He didn't rush. He didn't fumble. He rose with the quiet confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his mind. "Yes, Your Honor," he said evenly. "Is there a reason for that?" the judge asked. William met his gaze. "Because everything I needed to say was already written down." A murmur rippled through the room. Rebecca felt her chest tighten. Dorothy's fingers curled into her sleeve. Nathan's jaw set hard. William continued, voice calm but unwavering. "I believe the court deserved facts, not reactions. Patterns, not accusations." The judge nodded slowly. William sat back down. That was all. But it was enough. The illusion Rebecca had constructed, the image of a man too weak to stand up for himself, fractured in that moment. Because silence, when backed by preparation, was no longer absence. It was strategy. Elaine resumed, now moving into deeper territory, legal filings, ownership structures, trusts established during the marriage. The complexity of it all began to overwhelm Rebecca's team, who had assumed the case would never reach this depth. Dorothy shifted uneasily. She had always dismissed William's intelligence as unthreatening. Now she felt the sharp sting of miscalculation. Nathan's phone buzzed again. He ignored it. He couldn't afford to look. William watched them all, not with satisfaction, but with something closer to resolve. This was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming truth. And the truth, once uncovered, had a way of forcing everyone to confront the lies they had used to justify their choices. As the judge called for the next phase of testimony, William folded his hands again, posture steady. The marriage they had mocked was being re-examined not as a failure, but as a foundation others had exploited. And for the first time since the trial began, the question hanging in the air was no longer whether William Smith would lose. It was how much the others would have to answer for when everything they had taken for granted was laid bare. The judge adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the file, unaware that the silence he was about to break would redraw every life in that room. William Smith stood motionless at the defendant's table, dressed in a plain gray suit that seemed intentionally forgettable. He looked like a man already erased from the future everyone else had planned. To the spectators, he was the fool who married above his station. To his wife, Evelyn Smith, he was a mistake she could finally correct. To her mother, Margaret Collins, he was a stain that had lingered far too long. And to the man sitting smugly in the back row, Daniel Ross William was nothing more than a hurdle already cleared. The case was simple on paper. Divorce, asset division, allegations of financial incompetence. Evelyn's attorney had painted William as a failed husband who lived off her generosity, a man who contributed nothing but excuses. Exhibit after exhibit reinforced the same narrative. Modest bank statements, an outdated car registration, a resume that ended abruptly 5 years ago. The courtroom had eaten it up. When Evelyn testified, she didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her calm voice did the work for her. "I loved him," once she said, eyes shining under the lights. "But love doesn't pay bills. Love doesn't build a future. I carried this marriage on my back." Margaret nodded dramatically behind her, whispering just loudly enough for nearby spectators to hear. "We warned her." Daniel Ross leaned back, arms crossed, a faint smile curling at the corner of his mouth. He had already imagined his next steps, moving into Evelyn's penthouse, stepping fully into the life William had never deserved. William didn't interrupt. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look at them. When it was his turn to speak, his lawyer, a quiet man named Robert Hale, stood and asked only one question. "Mr. Smith," Robert said evenly, "did you sign any prenuptial agreement before your marriage?" "Yes," William replied. A few people chuckled. Evelyn's lawyer smirked. "And what did that agreement state?" Robert continued. William met the judge's eyes for the first time. "That neither party could claim ownership over assets held in private trusts or corporate entities registered prior to the marriage." The chuckles faded, but only slightly. Evelyn's lawyer waved it off. "Irrelevant. Mr. Smith has no such assets." Robert nodded. "That's what we're here to clarify." He reached into his briefcase and placed a thin folder on the table. The sound was barely audible, yet it felt louder than any gavel strike. "Your Honor," Robert said, "we request permission to submit additional documentation regarding Mr. Smith's financial standing." Evelyn turned sharply. "What is this?" Daniel's smile stiffened. The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Proceed." Robert opened the folder slowly, deliberately. 5 years ago, William Smith resigned from his position as a senior financial architect at a private investment firm in New York. Shortly after, he became the sole beneficiary and managing trustee of the Horizon Blackstone Trust. Margaret laughed out loud. "That sounds fake." Robert didn't look at her. The Horizon Blackstone Trust currently holds controlling shares in 12 multinational subsidiaries across technology, logistics, and renewable energy sectors. The courtroom shifted. Murmurs rippled through the benches. Evelyn stood halfway from her seat. "That's impossible." Robert raised a hand. "According to documents filed with the SEC and verified by 2 independent auditors, the trust's current valuation stands at approximately $9.8 billion. Silence slammed into the room. Daniel's face drained of color. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. No sound coming out. Evelyn slowly sank back into her chair. "You're lying," she whispered. William finally spoke again. "No, I was hiding." The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Smith, why was this not disclosed earlier?" "Because," William said calmly, "the prenuptial agreement didn't require it. And because I wanted a marriage where I was loved for who I was, not what I owned." Evelyn's attorney scrambled to regain control. "Your Honor, even if this is true, Mrs. Smith supported him emotionally and socially," Robert cut in. Mrs. Smith signed a clause explicitly waiving spousal claims to undisclosed trusts, provided they were established prior to marriage. We have her signature, dated, notarized. The judge reviewed the document in silence. Each second felt heavier than the last. Daniel stood abruptly. This is absurd. He pretended to be broke. William turned his head slightly. I pretended to be ordinary. There's a difference. Daniel's voice rose. You deceived her, no? William replied. I trusted her. Evelyn's hands trembled in her lap. All this time, the apartment, the car, I paid for everything, William said. Through a shell account you never asked about. Because you never cared. Margaret finally found her voice. You humiliated our family. William looked at her with quiet clarity. You humiliated yourselves. The judge cleared his throat. Given this new information, the court will dismiss all claims against Mr. Smith regarding financial negligence. Furthermore, Mrs. Smith's petition for asset division is denied in full. Evelyn shot to her feet. You can't do this, I already did, the judge replied. Daniel stepped back, eyes darting around the room as whispers turned into pointed stares. The man who had walked in confident now looked like a stranger in hostile territory. William gathered his papers' movements unhurried. As he passed Evelyn, she reached for his sleeve. William, she said softly, desperation creeping into her voice. We can talk about this. He paused, then gently removed her hand. We already did. You just didn't know it. Outside the courtroom, flashes from reporters' cameras exploded like lightning. Headlines were already being written. The man they mocked, the husband they discarded, the billionaire who never needed to prove it. William stepped into the sunlight, breathing deeply for the first time in years. The weight he had carried, not of money, but of silence, lifted from his shoulders. Behind him, everything burned. And ahead of him, a far greater story was only just beginning. The courthouse steps became a battlefield of whispers the moment William Smith disappeared into the waiting car. Reporters surged forward. Microphones raised voices overlapping each, trying to claim the first soundbite from the man who had just rewritten his own public identity. Inside, Evelyn remained frozen, staring at the empty space he had occupied moments earlier, as if the truth might rewind itself if she refused to move. Part 9 did not begin with shouting or tears. It began with silence, the kind that arrives only after a life collapses. Daniel Ross was the first to break it. He reached for Evelyn's arm, instinctively seeking alignment, safety, control. She recoiled as if burned. Don't touch me, she hissed. Margaret Collins stood rigid, her earlier arrogance replaced by something far more dangerous, panic. For years, she had built her authority on one belief that wealth equaled worth, and that she alone knew how to recognize it. Now the room was staring at her, as the woman who had misjudged a billionaire and treated him like disposable trash. This isn't over. Margaret muttered more to herself than anyone else. We can appeal. We can no. Evelyn snapped, finally finding her voice. There's nothing left to appeal. She looked around the courtroom. People were still there, but none of them were on her side anymore. The sympathy she had counted on had evaporated, replaced by judgment sharp enough to cut. Across the aisle, Robert Hale quietly packed his briefcase. He had seen many reversals in his career, but few as complete as this. As he turned to leave, the judge stopped him. Mr. Hale, the judge said, lowering his voice, your client handled himself with restraint. Robert nodded. That was the hardest part, Your Honor. Outside, William sat in the back seat of the car, staring out at the city he had once tried to disappear into. The driver asked if he wanted to go home. William shook his head. No, take me to the office. The building was unmarked from the outside glass-steel anonymity by design. Inside, however, it was the nerve center of everything he had built in silence. Executives rose when he entered. No applause, no congratulations, just respect. In the top-floor conference room, William stood alone by the window. The city looked different now. Not because it had changed, but because he no longer needed to hide from it. 5 years earlier, he had chosen obscurity over power. He had wanted to know if he could be loved without leverage. The answer, painful as it was, had now been delivered in public. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Evelyn, please, just talk to me." He didn't reply. Downstairs, the news cycle was already devouring the story. Headlines painted him as a genius strategist, a silent titan, a man who had orchestrated his own underestimation. Others were less kind to Evelyn. Social climber misjudges husband. Divorce court disaster. From penthouse to public shame. Daniel Ross watched it all unfold from a bar across town, glass trembling in his hand. Calls went unanswered. Invitations vanished. The world that had welcomed him so warmly only days ago had turned cold, transactional. He realized too late that he had never been admired, only tolerated. Margaret returned home alone that night. The house felt smaller. Her friends hadn't called. The group chats were silent. For the first time in decades, she had no narrative to control, no audience willing to listen. And Evelyn? Evelyn sat in the penthouse that no longer felt like hers. Boxes lined the walls. The air smelled of cardboard and regret. She replayed every moment, every comment, every look of disgust she'd thrown at William. Each one now echoed back at her with brutal clarity. She had believed power was loud. William had proven it could be quiet. 3 days later, William stood before the board of Horizon Blackstone Trust for the first time in years. Not as a shadow, not as a proxy, but as himself. "We move forward," he said simply. "No press statements, no interviews. Let the results speak." They nodded. They always had. That evening, he returned to the apartment he once shared with Evelyn. The space was stripped bare, echoes bouncing off white walls. He walked through each room slowly, not with sadness, but with closure. In the bedroom, he paused, then removed a single framed photo from the drawer. He didn't break it. He didn't tear it apart. He placed it face down and left it there. Outside, night fell softly. As William stepped into the elevator, his phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Evelyn. It was a number he hadn't seen in years. He answered. "Yes," a calm voice responded. "Mr. Smith, this is the U.S. Attorney's Office. We'd like to speak with you regarding several irregularities connected to Daniel Ross and a series of financial disclosures, some of which intersect with your former marriage." William closed his eyes, not in fear, but in understanding. The truth had surfaced once. Now it was ready to finish the job. The elevator doors slid shut. And Part 9 ended, not with revenge complete, but with justice preparing its final move. The call from the U.S. Attorney's Office lingered in William Smith's mind long after the elevator doors had closed. He stood alone in the quiet of his private garage, the city humming faintly above him, and understood something with absolute clarity. The courtroom humiliation had only been the first crack. What followed would not be public spectacle. It would be methodical, relentless, and irreversible. 2 days later, William sat across from a federal investigator in a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. The investigator, a woman named Laura Bennett, spoke with the calm precision of someone who never wasted words. "We've been tracking Daniel Ross for over 18 months, she said. Shell companies, falsified income reports, hidden equity transfers. Your former marriage intersects because several of those transfers were routed through accounts opened in your wife's name." William didn't flinch. He had suspected as much long before the divorce papers were filed. "They assumed I wouldn't notice," he replied quietly. Laura gave a thin smile. They assumed you were who they thought you were. Documents slid across the table. Wire transfers, digital signatures, emails recovered from encrypted servers. Each page painted the same picture. Daniel had used Evelyn as a financial shield, and Margaret Collins had provided legal guidance disguised as maternal advice. It wasn't just betrayal. It was conspiracy. Meanwhile, Evelyn's world was collapsing in slow motion. Her lawyer stopped returning calls. Her credit cards were suddenly declined. Friends she had once dismissed as irrelevant now avoided her entirely. Even the building concierge treated her differently, polite but distant, as if she were already a ghost. She finally agreed to meet Daniel. They chose a cafe far from their usual haunts. No paparazzi, no luxury, just cheap coffee and uncomfortable silence. "This is your fault," Daniel snapped the moment she sat down. "You said he was nobody." Evelyn laughed bitterly. "You said you had everything under control." Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You need to talk to him. Get him to fix this." She stared at him, stunned. "Fix what? Your crimes?" He slammed his hand on the table. "Our future." That word "our" felt obscene now. At that same hour, Margaret Collins sat across from her own attorney, the confidence she had worn for decades, finally cracking. The attorney's tone was grim. "They're opening a formal investigation," he said. "If they can prove intent, prison is a possibility." Margaret scoffed, but it sounded hollow. "I was protecting my daughter. You were advising her to hide assets," he replied flatly. Silence followed. Back at Horizon Blackstone Trust, William convened a closed-door meeting with his legal team. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing timelines, risk assessments, and potential fallout. When they finished, he nodded once. "I will cooperate fully," he said, "but I won't interfere." One attorney hesitated. "You understand this could destroy them." William's gaze was steady. "They destroyed themselves. I simply stopped protecting them." That night, Evelyn finally sent another message. "Evelyn, I didn't know about the illegal parts, I swear. Please, I'm scared." William read it twice. Then he typed a single sentence. "William, so was I. For years." He didn't block her. He didn't respond again. The arrests began quietly. Daniel Ross was detained during a routine traffic stop that wasn't routine at all. His phone was confiscated, his accounts frozen. Within hours, his name vanished from company websites, replaced by former executive. Margaret Collins was served papers at her home. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as federal agents walked out carrying boxes. Evelyn learned about it all from the news. She sat on the floor of her nearly empty penthouse, back against the wall, as the anchor spoke in calm, measured tones about fraud, asset concealment, and an ongoing investigation tied to a high-profile divorce case. Her name wasn't mentioned. Yet. She realized then what true isolation felt like, not just being alone, but being exposed. William stood on his balcony that evening, the city lights stretching endlessly before him. There was no satisfaction in what was happening, only a strange, heavy quiet. Justice, he had learned, was not loud. It arrived like gravity, slow, unavoidable. His phone rang one last time that night. "Laura Bennett, we may need your testimony," William exhaled. "When soon?" He ended the call and looked up at the dark sky. For the first time since the trial, he allowed himself a single, honest thought, not of revenge, not of pain, but of freedom. Part 10. Closed with the world finally catching up to the truth William had carried alone for years. And the cost of betrayal was about to be paid in full. The federal courthouse felt different when William Smith returned, not as a defendant, not as a husband fighting for dignity, but as a witness. The marble floors echoed under his measured steps, each one steady, deliberate. He noticed the glances this time. Not mockery, not pity. Curiosity laced with something else, respect. In a secured waiting room, he sat alone. Hands folded, his thoughts unusually calm. He wasn't rehearsing answers. He wasn't bracing for attack. The truth, once hidden, had a way of standing on its own. When Laura Bennett entered, she carried a slim folder and a look of quiet resolve. "They're ready for you." The hearing was closed to the public, but the weight inside the room was unmistakable. Daniel Ross sat at the defense table, no longer polished, no longer smiling. His suit hung awkwardly as if it belonged to a different man. Margaret Collins sat several seats away, lips pressed tight, her eyes avoiding everyone. Evelyn was not there. William took the stand and raised his hand. The oath felt less like a formality and more like a line drawn in stone. He spoke plainly about the early years of the marriage, about choosing anonymity, about discovering irregularities and choosing silence, not out of fear, but out of hope that the people he loved would stop before it was too late. "They didn't know who I was," the prosecutor asked. Did that matter? William met her gaze. Only to them. Hours passed. Documents were entered into record. Emails were read aloud. Each piece tightened the net. Daniel's attorney objected, often unsuccessfully. Margaret's composure fractured in small, visible ways, a trembling hand, a shallow breath. When it was over, William stepped down without ceremony. Outside reporters waited, but he declined to speak. This story, he knew, no longer belonged to headlines. Evelyn watched the coverage alone from a small rental apartment across town. The luxury had vanished. So had the certainty. She clutched her phone, scrolling through old photos, vacations, dinners, moments she had once dismissed as ordinary. She saw them differently now. Her lawyer finally called. "They may subpoena you," he said. "We need to prepare." "For what?" she whispered. "For the truth." The word landed like a verdict. That night, Evelyn stood in front of a mirror she hadn't bothered to unpack yet. She studied her reflection, no makeup, tired eyes, a woman stripped of performance. For the first time, she asked herself a question she had avoided for years. Who am I without status across the city? William sat in his office long after everyone else had left. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that allowed thoughts to surface without resistance. He wasn't reliving the trial. He was remembering the man he had been before all of it, before love became a test, before trust became a liability. He realized something then. Healing wasn't about winning. It was about reclaiming the parts of himself he had given away too easily. Weeks passed. Daniel Ross accepted a plea deal. The charges were reduced, but the sentence was not light. When the news broke, there was no outrage, no defense from former allies. Only silence. Margaret Collins fought longer. Pride demanded it. But evidence does not bend to pride. When the verdict came down, it was decisive. Her reputation, carefully constructed over decades, collapsed in a single afternoon. Evelyn was called in last. The interview room was smaller than she expected. The questions were direct. She answered honestly, tears blurring her vision more than once. She admitted what she had known. She admitted what she had ignored. When it ended, she felt emptied, but strangely lighter. No charges were filed against her. Cooperation came with a cost, but also with mercy. She left the building and sat on the steps, the sun warm on her face. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to pretend. William learned of the outcome from Laura Bennett over a brief call. "It's done," she said. He thanked her and ended the call, then stood by the window, watching the city move below. There was no triumph in his chest, only closure. That evening, he returned to the courthouse one last time, not for a hearing, but to retrieve a personal item from his former attorney's office. As he walked out, he noticed Evelyn standing across the street. They locked eyes. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she stepped forward. "William, I just wanted to say," he raised a hand gently, not in anger, in boundary. "I know," he said. She nodded, tears spilling freely now. "I hope you're happy." He considered the word carefully. "I'm at peace." She watched him walk away, understanding at last that peace was something she would have to find on her own. Part 11 closed, not with confrontation, but with separation, the final, quiet kind. And sometimes that was the hardest ending of all. Time did not rush in to fill the emptiness left behind. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if testing whether William Smith was truly ready to live without the weight he had carried for so long. The weeks after the trials passed, without drama, without headlines calling his name. For the first time in years, his life was quiet, and the silence felt earned. William took a leave from Horizon Blackstone Trust, something he had never done before. No meetings, no strategy calls, no boardroom battles. He left the city and drove north along the coast, following roads that curved beside the ocean like unanswered questions. He rented a modest house overlooking the water, waking each morning to the sound of waves breaking without asking permission. There, stripped of roles and expectations, memories began to surface. Not of the courtroom, not of humiliation, but of smaller moments. He had buried Evelyn laughing once in the kitchen before ambition sharpened her edges the first year of marriage, when hope had still felt possible. The decision he made to hide who he was because he wanted to be chosen without conditions. He realized now how deeply that choice had shaped everything that followed. One afternoon, William walked along the beach as the tide rolled in cold foam, brushing his shoes. He thought about power, how people chased it, feared it, worshipped it. And yet in the end, it had not saved his marriage, his dignity, or his peace. Silence had. Patience had. Truth delivered at the right moment had done what force never could. Back in the city, the consequences continued to unfold. Daniel Ross was sentenced quietly. No cameras, no statements. The man who once thrived on attention entered the system without applause or sympathy. In prison intake, he was just another number. The arrogance that had fueled him had nowhere to go. Margaret Collins faced a different punishment. Her sentence included probation and restitution, but the real cost was social exile. Invitations stopped coming. Her phone rarely rang. She spent her days in a carefully maintained home that now felt like a museum of better times. For the first time, she had no audience to perform for and no one to blame but herself. Evelyn moved into a smaller apartment near the edge of the city. She took a job she had once dismissed as beneath her working long hours, learning to answer to someone else without resentment. At night, she attended therapy, confronting truths she had avoided her entire adult life. The process was slow, painful, and deeply humbling. She did not try to contact William again. She knew some doors once closed, with dignity, should remain closed. William returned to work months later, not as the man he had been, but as someone quieter, more precise. His colleagues noticed the change immediately. He delegated more. He listened longer. He no longer needed to prove anything. At a quarterly meeting, one of the younger executives stayed behind. "Can I ask you something?" she said cautiously. William nodded. "Why didn't you stop them sooner? You had the power." He considered the question, then answered honestly. "Because I needed to know who they were without it." She nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his words. Later that week, William received a letter, not an email, not a call, a handwritten letter from a legal aid organization. They thanked him for an anonymous donation that had funded representation for men facing unjust divorce settlements, false accusations, and financial manipulation. William read it twice, then placed it in a drawer. He didn't want recognition. He wanted balance. One evening, as autumn settled into the city, William attended a small dinner hosted by a mutual acquaintance. It wasn't a networking event. No press, just conversation and understated laughter. Across the table sat a woman named Claire Reynolds, a social worker with tired eyes and an unguarded smile. They talked about ordinary things, books, travel, work that mattered more than money. She didn't ask what he did. He didn't volunteer it. When the night ended, she smiled and said, "It was nice talking without pretending." William felt something shift. Not excitement, not longing, just ease. As weeks turned into months, that ease followed him. He rebuilt his routines, morning runs, quiet dinners, volunteering time, not just money. He learned that healing was not a single moment of triumph. It was 1,000 small decisions to live differently. One night, standing alone on his balcony, William looked out at the city lights. The same city that had once watched him be mocked now moved on without noticing him at all. And he was grateful. Because anonymity, when chosen freely, was no longer a wound, it was a gift. He understood now that the judge's words in that courtroom had not given him justice. They had simply allowed the truth to breathe. What he did afterward, that was where meaning lived. William Smith was no longer defined by betrayal. He was defined by what he refused to become. And as part 12 came to a close, one thing was certain: the story was no longer about revenge or exposure. It was about rebuilding a life that no longer required silence to survive. Winter arrived quietly, without ceremony, as if the city itself had learned restraint. Snow softened the edges of buildings, muted the noise of traffic, and forced everything to slow down, including William Smith. He welcomed it. For the first time in his adult life, his calendar was not a battlefield. No emergency calls, no hidden fires to extinguish. Just long mornings, deliberate afternoons, and evenings that belonged to no one but himself. Yet, healing, William learned, was not passive. Silence could soothe, but it could also invite old ghosts back into the room. One evening, while reviewing reports in his home office, William paused at a familiar name. Buried in a footnote, an old investment partner from years before his marriage. Someone who had quietly withdrawn when William chose anonymity. The memory stirred something uncomfortable. The realization that betrayal had not begun with Evelyn. It had simply been the most personal form of it. Power, he understood now, did not corrupt people. It revealed them. The thought stayed with him as he accepted an invitation to speak at a closed forum on ethical leadership, a small gathering, no press allowed. He almost declined. Visibility still felt like a risk. But something inside him said it was time to stop shrinking. The room was modest, the audience attentive. William spoke without slides, without rehearsed rhetoric. "I once believed hiding my strength would protect my relationships," he said. "I was wrong. It only delayed the truth. The right people don't need you to be smaller. They need you to be honest." The silence afterward was heavy, not awkward, but reflective. Among the attendees was Claire Reynolds. She waited until most people had left before approaching him. "You sounded like someone who's paid the price for that lesson." William met her eyes. "I did." She nodded, not pushing further. That restraint mattered more to him than any sympathy ever could. They began seeing each other slowly. No labels, no promises. Just time, shared walks, quiet dinners, conversations that didn't feel like negotiations. Claire never asked about Evelyn. She didn't need the details to understand the damage. What surprised William most was how much effort it took to let someone see him without armor. Vulnerability, he discovered, was not weakness. It was unfamiliar muscle. Across town, Evelyn's life continued its steady, humbling reconstruction. She shared a small office with 2 coworkers half her age. She learned a budget to ask for help, to sit with discomfort, instead of masking it with superiority. Therapy peeled back layers she hadn't known existed. Her fear of being ordinary, her dependence on external validation, her habit of mistaking control for security. One night, after a particularly difficult session, she wrote a letter she never intended to send. I loved you the wrong way, she wrote. I loved what you could protect me from, not who you were when you had nothing to prove. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Some truths she understood were meant to stay private. Margaret Collins rarely left her home now. The world had not forgiven her, and she no longer had the energy to demand that it should. In the quiet, she replayed conversations she once dismissed, warnings she had ignored. Pride, she realized too late, was expensive. Daniel Ross wrote letters from prison that went unanswered. Spring crept in as winter loosened its grip. William stood in the same courtroom again, not as a participant, but as an observer. A nonprofit he supported was defending a man falsely accused in a divorce proceeding, stripped of access to his children by allegations that didn't survive scrutiny. As William watched the man testify, hands shaking, voice cracking, something hardened and softened inside him at the same time. He recognized the look, the confusion of being judged by people who had already decided who you were. After the hearing, William funded the organization openly this time. Not for recognition, for alignment. Later that day, Claire joined him for coffee. You're changing the system, she said gently. William shook his head. I'm just refusing to ignore it. She smiled. That's how change usually starts. That evening, as they walked through the park, Claire asked a question that stopped him. Do you ever miss her? William didn't answer right away. He searched himself carefully. I miss the man I was before I stopped trusting my own instincts, he said finally. But I don't miss the marriage. Claire reached for a hand, not to claim, not to reassure, but to acknowledge the honesty it took to say that out loud. The city lights flickered on around them. William felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not excitement, not fear, but quiet confidence, the kind that didn't need witnesses. At home later that night, he received a message from Laura Bennett. Case closed. Final filings completed. William read it once, then deleted it. There was nothing left to revisit. He stood by the window, watching the city move imperfect, relentless, alive. He thought about the judge's voice that day, how a single sentence had shifted everything. But the real transformation he knew now hadn't happened in court. It had happened afterward, in the choices no one applauded, in the boundaries no one saw, in the life rebuilt without needing to be proven right. As Part 13 drew to a close, William Smith was no longer a man defined by what had been taken from him. He was defined by what he'd chosen to grow into. And the most important chapter of his life, quiet, grounded, unafraid, was only just beginning. By the time summer returned, it no longer felt like a season, it felt like permission. Permission to live openly, to stop measuring each step against old wounds, to let the future exist without interrogation. William Smith sensed the shift not in grand moments, but in small, almost invisible ones, the way he slept through the night without waking to phantom anxiety, the way laughter came easier, the way silence no longer felt like something to survive. Horizon Blackstone Trust had never been healthier. Profits were steady risk exposure, controlled leadership aligned. But for William's success no longer lived in spreadsheets. It lived in balance. One afternoon, he received an invitation to attend a legal reform symposium in Washington, D.C. well, not as a financier, but as a private citizen who had supported policy change from the shadows. He hesitated before accepting. Public spaces still carried echoes of the courtroom. Claire noticed his hesitation. "You don't owe the past your absence," she said gently. So he went. The symposium was restrained, almost austere. Judges, attorneys, policy advisors, no theatrics. William sat near the back, listening as speaker after speaker addressed systemic failures. How truth could be buried beneath perception, how power imbalances distorted justice, how quiet suffering often went unnoticed. When his turn came, he didn't step onto the stage. He spoke from his seat. "I was believed to be powerless," he said evenly. "Not because I was, but because I allowed others to define me. Justice didn't come when I revealed my strength. It came when I refused to lie about who I was. There was no applause, but there was understanding." Afterward, a judge approached him, an older man with tired eyes and steady hands. "You know," he said, "people think courtrooms are about winning. They're not. They're about correction." William nodded. "Sometimes correction takes time. Sometimes it takes restraint," the judge added. Back in the city, Evelyn stood on the balcony of her modest apartment, watching the sunset bleed into the skyline. She had been promoted that week, not dramatically, not ceremonially, but honestly. Her supervisor had praised her consistency, her reliability, her growth. For the first time, the compliment didn't feel hollow. She had learned to sit with her mistakes without letting them define her. She volunteered now, quietly helping women navigate life after public failure. She didn't tell her story unless asked. She didn't seek redemption. She practiced responsibility. Margaret Collins received her final notice that summer, the sale of her home. Downsizing was inevitable. She packed decades of possessions into boxes, each item a reminder of how much she had once valued appearance over substance. Alone in the empty house, she acknowledged something painful and necessary. She had taught her daughter ambition without integrity. The cost of that lesson echoed long after the house stood empty. William and Claire traveled together for the first time that fall. No luxury resorts, just long roads, unfamiliar towns, conversations uninterrupted by status. They stayed in small hotels, ate in places without reviews, walked without destination. One night, sitting beside a fire in a quiet lodge, Claire asked, "What scares you now?" William considered it carefully. "Becoming closed," he said, "confusing peace with distance." She smiled. "Then don't." The simplicity of it surprised him. Months later, Horizon Blackstone Trust hosted a charity event, not to announce donations, but to listen. Survivors of financial abuse. Men and women who had lost everything in divorces twisted by manipulation. William didn't speak that night. He stayed among them, hearing stories that sounded uncomfortably familiar. He realized something then: healing didn't end when pain stopped. It ended when empathy replaced it. Late that evening, alone in his office, William opened an old file he had kept sealed for years. Inside were documents from the earliest days of his marriage, letters, agreements, plans made in good faith. He read them slowly, then closed the file. He deleted it, not because it hurt, but because it no longer mattered. Outside, the city lights reflected in the glass, no longer distorted by fear or anger. William understood now that justice had been a moment, but dignity was a practice. As summer faded into autumn once more, he stood at his window and thought about the man who had once stood in court, mocked and underestimated. That man no longer needed defending. Part 14 closed with no cliffhanger, no spectacle, only the quiet certainty that when truth is finally honored, it does not demand revenge. It demands responsibility. And William Smith was finally free to carry it without weight. The final chapter did not arrive with noise. It arrived on an ordinary morning, the kind that once would have passed unnoticed, sunlight slipping through the windows, the city moving at its usual impatient rhythm, the world unconcerned with anyone's private victories or losses. William Smith woke before his alarm not because of anxiety, but because his mind was clear. That alone felt like an ending. He stood in the kitchen, coffee brewing, and watched the steam rise slowly. Years ago, mornings like this had been filled with tension, anticipation of conflict, the quiet dread of being misunderstood inside his own home. Now there was only space. Claire joined him, still half asleep, leaning against the counter. They didn't speak right away. They didn't need to. Their relationship had grown without urgency. No dramatic declarations, no promises made under pressure, just consistency, respect. The steady presence of someone who did not need him to be smaller or louder, only honest. Later that day, William attended one final legal proceeding connected to the fallout of the case. It was procedural, administrative, the kind of closure no one reports on. As he signed the last document, the clerk glanced at his name, then up at him. "You're done," she said simply. He nodded, feeling the weight of that word settle into him, not relief exactly, but completion. Outside the courthouse, there were no cameras waiting, no whispers, no one pointing. The steps were empty, washed in pale afternoon light. William paused there for a moment, not out of habit, but out of acknowledgement. This was where everything had turned. Not because justice had been spoken aloud, but because he had finally stopped protecting lies that weren't his to carry. He walked away without looking back. That evening, Horizon Blackstone Trust held a private board meeting. William addressed them calmly, without ceremony. "I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations," he said, effective immediately. There was surprise, but no panic. He had prepared them well. "I'll remain involved," he continued, "but leadership should never depend on one person staying silent or invisible." The board accepted it unanimously. For the first time, William wasn't building an exit strategy. He was building space. Across the city, Evelyn finished her shift and locked the office door behind her. She walked home through familiar streets, no longer scanning reflections in windows, no longer bracing for judgment. People passed her without recognition, and she welcomed it. She had learned something difficult, and honest obscurity could be a teacher if you let it. At home, she opened the drawer where the unsent letter still rested. She reread it once more, then tore it in half. Not in anger, in acceptance. Some apologies existed to change behavior, not to reopen doors. Margaret Collins spent her evening unpacking boxes in a smaller home, far from the circles she once dominated. The silence was heavy, but not cruel. It forced reflection. It forced accountability. And for the first time, she did not run from it. Daniel Ross marked another day inside walls that did not care who he once pretended to be. Time stripped of performance worked on him slowly. Consequences, unlike revenge, did not rush. Weeks later, William and Claire traveled again, this time without destination. They drove until the city dissolved into open road, until signs grew scarce and the world felt wide again. One night, parked beneath a sky scattered with stars, Claire asked softly, "Do you think everything happens for a reason?" William looked up, considering. "No," he said. "I think meaning happens when we decide what to do after." She smiled, satisfied with that answer. On their return, William donated the last of a fund he had quietly maintained, money set aside not for punishment, but for prevention, legal education, counseling access, resources for people trapped in narratives they didn't create. He didn't attach his name. He didn't need to. On a quiet Sunday morning, William stood on his balcony, watching the city wake. Cars moved, People hurried. Somewhere arguments were beginning. Somewhere else forgiveness was forming. Life continued indifferent to personal closure. And yet he felt something profound. Peace not as an absence of pain, but as the presence of truth. He thought of the courtroom again, not the laughter, not the mockery, but the moment the judge spoke. How silence had fallen, how assumptions had collapsed under the weight of reality. That moment had not restored his marriage. It had restored his agency. William Smith was no longer the man being judged by others' expectations. He was the man who had learned when to remain silent and when to let the truth speak for itself. As the sun climbed higher, he turned back inside, closing the door gently behind him. The story did not end with applause. It ended with alignment. And sometimes that is the most powerful ending of all. What this story ultimately teaches us is not about wealth courtrooms or dramatic reversals of fate. It is about identity and the quiet danger of allowing others to define your worth. William Smith did not lose because he was weak. He suffered because he chose silence in a world that rewards performance. He believed love would exist without truth, that humility meant hiding, and that patience could replace boundaries. The betrayal did not begin when he was mocked in court. It began the moment he abandoned his own voice to keep the peace. And yet, this is not a story about bitterness or revenge. It is a story about restraint, about trusting that truth, when carried with dignity, does not need to shout, about understanding that justice is not always loud and healing is rarely immediate. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining yourself and let reality speak. This story reminds us that people who mock you at your lowest often reveal more about themselves than about you. That love built on status will collapse the moment status changes. And that real power is not the ability to destroy those who wronged you, but the courage to rebuild without becoming like them. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been misunderstood, underestimated, or betrayed in silence? Share your feelings in the comments. Your voice might help someone else feel less alone. And if you're drawn to stories about truth, resilience, and finding dignity after betrayal, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. More powerful stories like this are coming, and you're always welcome here.